Hi, I'm Becca, and I work at St. Column's Park House in Derry. And I wanted to say today a few words about our approach to peace and reconciliation and the way in which we use the environment and think about the environment and the natural world in sort of everything that we do. So hopefully it'll be a little bit of food for thought for discussions of how people can take it back to their own work around peace and reconciliation. So we are very much obviously part of the environment, and the environment is part of us. And we think that's an important way to move forward in a peacemaking approach. And so St. Column's Park House is a peace and reconciliation center in the midst of St. Column's Park, which really is a gem of a park in Derry. It is there's a wildness to this park. There's trees in the morning, there's bird song, there are hawks that live here. There's both native trees and planted trees, as St. Column's Park House is an old, what was a manor house, and there were gardens around it. And in the past few years, their walled garden has been brought back to life, an old walled garden where there was an old wall through Peace for Money in partnership with the Derry and Strand District Council and St. Column's Park House have rebuilt the walled garden and have really thought about the ways in which we're integrating nature and cultivation into the work that we do. And so our peace approach now, I think we're really playing with the ideas around using the philosophy of permaculture. And so permaculture, for folks who are not as familiar with the term, is around using cultivation practices that reflect patterns and processes that are found in the natural world, in the natural environment. And so when I say cultivation practices, I mean not just in terms of cultivating the land, but also in terms of cultivating ourselves and our relationships, and our relationships with ourselves and others. And I think that we use this permaculture as both a metaphor, but also very literally in terms of how we think about the work that we do. And so there's sort of three major tenets to permaculture that filter through everything that we think about. So one is around people care, and how are the practices that we deal with ourselves and with each other that really reflect the entirety of the person. Earth care, and fair share. And so people care, when we think about how to approach peace, I think we have to think about how are we rebuilding people. So as we talked about, there's obviously a climate crisis that we're facing, but there's also a real crisis, I think, in society. We know that with health and well-being. We know that with, I think, the more we talk about the environment, there's sometimes, or climate change, there can be a bit of an anxiety that fills people with either dread or a feeling of not being able to do anything. And I think that there's a real a cynicism that exists. And so figuring out how do we rebuild people, the relationships with ourselves, with others in the environment to make us whole, so that we're able to do the type of peace work that we need to live in a better world for ourselves, for each other, and for the environment as a whole. And so our practices need to be nourishing, they need to be sustainable, and they need to be regenerative. And so how are we making sure that everything that we're doing in terms of meeting people in the park and in our programs are nourishing, sustainable, and regenerative? In terms of earth care, we think a lot about how we maintain our grounds, but how we're actually planning our activities with stewardship in mind. How are we learning from the environment? How are we looking at the patterns that we see in the natural world? How are we playing with noticing the native species amongst us, around us, How are we noticing the way that different seasons make us feel and bring us into spaces in different ways? How are we learning from the environment? And then how are we also thinking about, what types of things we would want to plant? For example, do we want to have in this space, do we want to have it be a very manicured space, or do we want there to be more wildness and more feelings of sort of the richness of the biodiversity that you see in more wild spaces? And then in terms of fair share, we talk a lot of that's where our justice, our social justice concepts come in. How do we make sure that we're not extracting from the environment, we're not extracting from relationships, or we're not extracting from ourselves or exploiting relationships, people, or resources, so that it leaves people feeling empty, or it leaves like Earth being empty. But it's actually the other way around. We sort of flip it on its head so that we can be as sustainable as possible. And so those are sort of the three of the philosophies that we use as part of the cornerstones of permaculture in order to really help us guide the types of programming and the types of relationships that we want to build through peacemaking here in St. Colum's Park House. And one of the things we think about is, well, how are we building peace within ourselves? Because in order for us to be in a space where we're able to work with others and have difficult conversations, and where we're able to have sort of the generosity of spirit, so that we're able to move forward in some of the harder issues around peace and reconciliation, ourselves, our comfort, our confidence, our feelings of security need to be met. But we also don't do that in a vacuum. We do that as within the collectivity of groups of different people around us as well as we do that in the context of sort of the biodiversity of the ecosystems that are around in the parks as well. And then, so the peace within, the peace with others, and so having those spaces for those conversations, and then thinking about peace through nature and through returning to some of the sort of older practices that people had. So someone mentioned foraging before. So there's the foraging of for berries, for foodstuffs, but also going back to sort of more ancient practices, building fires, sitting around, being able to tell stories and speak, having those spaces, around the fire. Is very important, and we have that here, and a lot of our programs use that whereas other programs might use a kitchen table in that same way, in terms of the ways in which you have cups of tea and sort of the relaxing nature of the kitchen table, the campfire and the stories and the oral history, and sort of coming back to our roots of being oral peoples, I think is one of the ways that people feel disarmed and can relate to one another. So the peace within, the peace with others, and the peace through the natural world and through nature. And so some of the programs that we do here really use those philosophies to push us through. So the youth programming that we do here, we have a program called the Wee Muckers, where young people spend a few hours outside as in programming, but it's not just outside in a built outdoor space. It's outside in sort of the wilds of the park here, foraging for different things that they might find in nature, learning from nature. We have an enormous horse chestnut tree that has acted as an outdoor classroom. When you sort of meander your way underneath it. It's where we have fires and we cook things on the fire. We tell stories. Kids hang hammocks from the large branches and find real safety and calm and peace. And I think in the first presentation, Craig had some of those stats around people who felt like during the pandemic being outside or being in the wild was calming and helped with people's anxiety and things like that. We see that every single day here through our programming with kids. And the fact that this is not overly structured outdoor time, but there's some activities, but also space and time for young people to become acquainted with what is it like to climb a tree, what is it like to hang a hammock, what is it like to explore and build forts through sticks, what is it like to build a fire, what is it like to collect, and to find different animals and species. What is it like to look at the difference between, the oak trees and what stories do they tell of our parks, our native oaks versus our beech trees that were planted? What does that tell us about the history of the land here and the stories that the generations before us have told in terms of the planted, the wild, the native, et cetera, and what kind of questions we can ask about all of that. So I think that's really, it's really interesting to see just how much young people have taken to and love the space of the park through that. Now that starts with, we have 5, 6, 7-year-olds, but we also have older youth through our Peace in the Park programs and Park Youth now, which are basically teenagers who see St. Columb Park and St. Columb Park House as their second home. It is a place where they feel safe. It is a place where they can have some difficult conversations with each other and around the difficulties of growing up today. And it's true, like the first speaker talked about how young people are absolutely committed to, I think, thinking about the environment. But I also think that it is terrifying for a lot of them. And so having a reconnection with nature and the calming impact of actually being in nature, and we are outside all the time, rain or shine, and using the canopy of the leaves of the forest as our shelters. I think hearing the rain pitter patter on the leaves, smelling the wetness of the soil, having those experiences, taking your shoes off, burying feet in the dirt and the muck. All of these experiences I think are extremely important, and they're experiences that not enough young people have. And so that is something that is really central to the way in which we see rebuilding the person, that are individuals within the ecosystem of the world in which we live in. And so we are really fortunate that we have the space such as St. Columb Park in order for us to actually have this type of programming. We also have a program here called Compassionate Campaigning. And this really tapped into what I would call accidental activists, people who became activists because something really important to them was at risk. So whether it was their land, the water which they drink, the air that they breathe, or maybe it was that they can't afford to live their life. The cost of living crisis is obviously a huge problem for the majority of people in our society right now. And so the program here tries to say, okay, how do we build the type of caring communities? How do we build people up to be able to be spokespeople to change the world around them, but in such a way that they are themselves filled up and nourished and taken care of in sort of by each other, by a community of other people who are trying to change the world, trying to change a specific thing, trying to change policy around whether it's there's a variety of different campaigns that have actually come through here through this program. But how do we make sure that it's not built on sort of the burnout and the frustration of not being able to, make the changes that you want to see, or being totally frustrated by the structures of our society that we're not able to make sort of more radical and more radical change. Was how do we help build up those people so that there's more resilience and that there's actually a sustainability in the type of campaigning that people are part of. And so the environmental gathering is one of the projects that has come out of compassionate campaigning. And the environmental gathering that meets here at St. Column's Park a few times a year brings together environmental activists and many people who don't call themselves activists, but just people who live here, not only across the north, but also across these islands, to meet and to share their own experiences around the type of struggles or campaigns that they're part of, whether it's against some of the gold mining here in the Barrens that has been really huge, or the people who are trying to protect the biodiversity of the Fahun Valley, the rivers, the river Foyle here, obviously, in Derry, but then really across not just the Northwest, but really across these islands. The concept of rights of nature has been a really, really key concept for the gathering, to really think about how is it that we make sure that we are respecting the integrity of nature. And the sustainability of nature, and seeing that we ourselves are very much part of nature, but also can be an invasive species that it can be detrimental to the biodiversity around us. And so that have been really important campaigns and spaces for people who have often felt very marginalized and maybe have felt that they haven't been listened to and haven't seen the changes that they want to see. And so that's part of what the gathering has done, is provided space for that. So that's another program here that has been, I think, very, very successful in integrating some of the philosophies that we're using around permaculture into how we talk to each other, talk to ourselves, and to ourselves. There's one other thing I just wanted to mention, because I wasn't going to talk for too long, though I could talk about a lot of different things. Is there's one of the philosophies within permaculture is around looking at edges and borders, particularly from one ecosystem to the other, because that's actually where sometimes you see some of the more creative things that are happening in ecosystems, because they're within the hedgerows of fields. If you think about estuaries in rivers and things like that, there's a huge amount of biodiversity in there, and so we pay a lot of attention to, well, who are on the edges or on the margins of society, or people who are maybe being forgotten about. And I think one that really has spoken to us a lot as a peace center, particularly in the context of peace and reconciliation, where we're often talking in two tribes languages here. And I think that has felt a little bit hand tying for us, because I think that a lot of people don't see themselves within two tribes, or don't see our society within two tribes, but actually see a lot of intersectionality between a variety of different identities, or no identity, or mixture of identity, or new identities that haven't actually been brought to the fore. And so one of the things that we look at a lot is who are on the margins of our society and who maybe haven't had the experience or haven't been allowed, or there's been some kind of hard border between them and having access to the natural world or to the ecosystems around them. And one or multiple groups of people that we have related to in particular are people with adults with different learning disabilities or physical disabilities that often don't have that much access to the natural world, and that might be because of the places in which they live, or they get sort of they might be bused to specific places, but in terms of accessibility are having a hard time being able to sort of access the beaches, the forests, the wildness of nature. And so we've spent a lot of time working with groups in terms of praxis, with green therapy, with other organizations around how do we use the park, how do we hear from them around how to have more access and more ability to share experiences of nature with each other across the board. So that's just one example, but there's lots of other communities that use the park that we'd want to talk to around access and their accessibility to nature, and where do they see boundaries and borders, and how do we begin to break those down?